Okay, welcome back. So I've had a little play around just with the HSV nodes, and I've done a little painting on the mask just to get the blending a trifle nicer. Nothing was particularly complicated. If I look at the base skin HSV, you can see I've just tweaked the hue shift, I've saturated a bit to make it a bit more bright and cheerful, and I've taken the value down to make it a little darker. So nothing you can't do by simply playing around with the sliders to get the color of dinosaur that you want. And I think I was about here on mine. So there we go. So I've chosen this green. I quite like it. I think it matches the color of the two-toning skin here with a kind of lizard belly effect now. And I'm quite happy. But you know, whatever you want to do, you've got a ton of control here in Mari over the color that you finally want to end up with. What I want to look at now is bump, because the skin is okay, but until it's bumped, we're not really going to start to see the spec playing with it or anything like that. So let's start off with the bump map. Now, when we first started our Mari project, you'll see that it asked us if we wanted to create a displacement or a bump map or a spec map, and we said no, just the color, which is just this color we're working on now, and this would be channels in Mari. So you can see we've got a color channel. Let's add another channel. So let's add a channel, and 240 by 248 is fine, so 2K, and the channel we can add at this point is bump. So I'm going to add that bump channel, okay, and then I'm going to add another channel, and I'm going to call this one spec. So you can change the name here. It doesn't really matter what's going on up here, just call it whatever you want, and let's go OK for spec. And the color is just what color the channel will initially be. So now you can see we've got a whole new layers palette. So if I flick to the color, you can see we've got all of our color textures here. Bump, we've got nothing but gray, and spec, we've got nothing but gray. So let's start out with a bump. Now, in order to do a bump on this, I want to obviously bump the skin pattern, but I don't want to take anything like the eyes and have bumps on those. And at the moment our claws are smooth, so I'm going to keep those fairly bump free. So in order to do this, I need to find out what layers are generating this skin pattern. I also want a bump underneath this white muzzle, so I want it to look like this white muzzle also has scales. So if I start turning some stuff off, the second tone color is not necessary to create a bump map. The solid color is not necessary to create a bump map because we want this color here. So let's have a look. Bone will be bump free, so I don't need to take that color. And let's see, we've got the underskin texture which we need to create that bump there. And we've got the base skin texture which we'll need to create the bump. So I'm going to select these, control select both of them, and then I'm going to duplicate these layers. So let's see here, duplicate. In fact, I can just control C and control V, and I'll get another copy of those. With them both selected, I'm going to turn everything else off and just select these two I've just made and go to layer and merge. So we should have a merge here somewhere, merge layers, there it is. And that will merge those layers we had selected, and this will form the foundation of our bump map. So I'm going to call that bump temp because it won't actually be in the color channel, it will be in the bump channel. But that allows us to quickly copy this, go to the bump channel and then paste it, get rid of the bump base layer, it's not necessary right now. And now I can make this black and white and start turning it into a bump map. So let's add an adjustment stack, and once again hue, saturation and value, and let's just turn the saturation down to none, and that will get us to black and white basically. There we go. And now this will form the foundation of our bump map, but there's a couple of things in here that we don't want. We don't want bump on the eyes. So let's go into the UV, and I'm going to paint everywhere that I don't want any bump, kind of white really. So let's just shift S and shift and click this patch and this patch, and then patches fill white for now. Okay, it doesn't like filling two at once. Let's just select this one, patches fill white. Okay, alright, it's not the two at once, my mistake. You need to have a layer selected. I'm not quite sure why I unselected that, but anyway, S, select both patches while holding shift, and patches fill white. There we go. So none of this will have any bump at all, which is fine for us right now. Let's go into the ortho and back to the UV, hit B just to make sure we bake that out. Okay, so that's going to be our basic bump map. Now from here, to control the amount of bump we want on everything, we can go into the UV view and use a levels. I'm going to look at this on the UV view, it's easier to see. Let's just come in here and open our adjustment stack and add an adjustment layer of levels. Okay, and now we can start to play around with the black and white balance. So I'm going to just increase the amount of white, bring the black down a little bit. Actually, it might be easier to do this with the mid-tones. There we go. So I just want a big distinction between these two, and this can take some fiddling around with. Okay, let's bring this one up so we get more bump. And that should do us for now on the bump map. So let's have a look at what that looks like in the orthographic view. And that's looking okay. That should be enough to get us bumpy. Alright, so we've got now a bump channel, and now we need to display this in Mari as a bump map. So let's go back to our color channel and let's hide the bump temp because we're not using it, and unhide all the other layers. Now we need to go into our shader, the blend shader that we used, and under bump channel we're going to pick bump, which this is just showing us, when I click here, this is showing us what channels I have available in Mari. So let's click bump. Okay, and you'll see that went bumpy. And we've got the bump under the muzzle, so our bump map appears to be working. And I'll just go and flick that on and off so you can see what difference it makes. At the moment we've got a bump of 0.1. If I go like so, you'll see it's completely flat. If I give it an exaggerated bump, you'll see our bump map is most definitely working there. So I'm going to want a bump of maybe 0.012 maybe. That's 12, that's obviously far too high. So what I was actually looking for is 0.012. Not quite high enough. So again, this is just for our reference purposes within Mari. We'll have to load this as a bump map in Maya, but this gives us a very good indication of what it's going to look like. Okay, so that looks like a decent bump map we've got on there now. I can see all the bump underneath this white muzzle, and now, you know, even though it's just white and we haven't done a lot of texture into it, it's definitely got some bump on there. So now I want to create a spec map, and the kind of spec map I want to create is to have less specular highlight in between these dark crevices and more on sort of the skin. So a very easy way to do this is to go into our channels, take our bump channel that we just created, copy the layer from it, go to the spec channel and paste the layer in. Okay, now I'm going to make that slightly opaque just to tone the whole thing down a little bit, because we've got this 50% grey base layer. So this will be my spec layer. However, I want my spec layer a little bit rougher than this. So I'm going to go for a procedural texture, and let's just create a procedural noise pattern. Let's try some Perlin noise here. Okay, so allow me to just bring this up, and let's get a smaller size, much smaller. Okay, so I want some very low res noise over this, and I'm going to take this color and make it kind of light gray. I don't want to use 100% white, and this color and make it a dark gray. There we go. And I'm going to actually lower the opacity of this Perlin noise a bit so we can still see the bump, and it just gives us that little breakup, you know, so I don't have completely white bits and then I want a little bit of noise introduced. So let's see here. Whoops, and that was the wrong slider. Okay, now this one's too big. Sorry, I've adjusted this one by mistake. That's about right. And just bring that down just to break up the surface. There we go. That'll about do it for me. Now you can always go over this again when you've seen what it looks like, maybe increase the size of the noise, increase the amount of noise. Again, we'll have to flick back to the color channel and see how this affects our spec. So let's go to color channel, let's go to our shader, and under specular here, let's actually under specular color here, let's give it our spec channel. Okay, and you won't have seen much of a difference, but because this shader doesn't actually have a lot of specular shininess to it, or a lot of specular, so let's turn that up to a point like so and get that kind of a sharp edge specular highlight. And you can really see that we're not getting as much spec in these channels as we are on the surface of the skin itself. So that will give us a nice spec map in Maya. You see how you can still clearly see the scales as the spec moves around. Now obviously this is shiny like plastic at the moment, so that's not a very good look for us. So I'm going to, whoops, wrong one. I'm going to just take that specular shininess and broaden up the highlight a little bit. Okay, and maybe reduce the overall amount of specularity. Okay, and again, this won't be exactly as we see it in Maya. This is just to give us an indication of what our spec and bump maps look like. But that's a fairly decent combination of spec and bump on there. I'm quite happy with that. One thing I did want to see is if it broke the texture of this muzzle up, which indeed it does, but we can actually break that up a bit more. If we go on to our solid color and we pop open our stack here, our adjustment stack, I can now use a, let's say, some sort of fractal noise pattern. So let's go for a fractal cloud. And you'll see this all changed. It'll be horrible. We just pin it. And what we need is to then pick some colors for our fractal cloud. So let's come in here and let's change the size of it. So we get this sort of rough, dirty kind of look. And then we'll want to pick a couple of colors for this. So that one, and let's go with this one again, but let's make it a bit darker. So let's come in and make that a bit darker. Okay, and this allows us just to break it up a little bit. Now obviously you'd need to be a bit more careful in your color choice, but it does allow you to just get, you know, a bit of roughness in there depending on what you're going for. So if I turn that off, you'll see the difference. Okay, so depending on the look you're going for, it gives us a little textured skin pattern in there, which I'm quite liking, and doesn't have the whole thing quite so uniform. Alright, but I'm pretty happy with that. I'm going to have a play with these colors during the break because they're not quite matching this now, but that's just a case of selecting the color here, getting a decent one, and then going back into the stack and changing one of these colors perhaps. So I'm quite liking that sort of color for the darkness, and let's make this light one possibly a bit more saturated and a bit darker. There you go. So that's basically what I do. I just have a play with that until it was more matching this again. Okay, looking pretty good. The bump is working really nicely. The spec, when we get it back into Maya, will help. I like the way we get, you know, very little spec in between here, which is what I was personally looking for. Okay, now one of the last issues we're going to have to deal with is Mari at the moment is shading this for us with some ambient occlusion. So if I go up to the shader and turn the ambient occlusion off, you'll see what we've got is fairly flat, this is what it will look like if we just brought it into Maya now. And obviously that's not what we're looking for. In fact, if I flat shade that, you'll see it even better. So that's what we've got. So we're going to need, because this is cartoony, we're going to actually need to come in and paint in some shadows and some highlights and things on this, which in Mari is a, I wouldn't say simple, but it's definitely got an easier way to do it than pretty much any other method I've seen. So when we come back, we'll start painting on our own skin tones. So we'll start painting out some shadows in the eyes, and we'll start painting out some highlights on the skin and all of that stuff. But I just wanted to get that speck and bump out of the way first. So that about does it for this part, and I'll see you on the next part when we'll finish up this little guy in Mari. I might change the eyes a little bit, and for the inside of the mouth I'm going to go with a very simple tooth texture and sort of a very dark red for the inside of the flesh parts of the mouth. So I hope to see you for that part, and thanks for watching. Cheers.